and start the, probably one of the more important sessions we will have today. They're all important, but this is a little bit more important than the other, about Freedom of Information and Records Act. So turn it over to Phyllis, Errico, and Maria.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It is no surprise that the most exciting topics are first thing in the morning. Yes. So we're really pleased to have such great attendance when we talk about such exciting things as the Public Records Act, the Freedom of Information Act, the State and Local Government Conflict of Interest Act. It does not get any better than this. At least that's what we think as lawyers. So that just tells you that we're not the ones to hang out with in the cocktail party, because it will be no fun. So that's going to be the best advice we give you today. Anyway, I am very pleased to be here. I am General Counsel for the Virginia Association of Counties. And as Ted mentioned, there are bios, detailed bios for all the speakers in your notebook. And really, really pleased to have Maria Everett here this morning. Maria is the Executive Director of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act Council. And it's a council that's made up of legislators and citizens and experts in public access. And they deal with some really difficult issues that state and local governments and agencies and boards and commissions face, dealing with access to public meetings and access to public documents. We're really, really lucky to have her this morning because she's also a senior attorney with the Division of Legislative Services, which means that she has been drafting bills 24 hours a day for the last, I don't know, month or so, if not more. She has had very little break in the action. So obviously I'm going to owe her a lot for being here this morning and taking her precious sleep to be here with us. So we're really lucky to have her. I'm going to speak very, very briefly about the Virginia Public Records Act before Maria speaks about the Freedom of Information Act. One of the really neat things about those of you who are new supervisors is something that once was just a piece of paper that you've touched that's come to you or that you've sent or just a website or just an email is probably now a public record. And the way that you think of everything that you deal with has to be thought of in the context of the Public Records Act. The Public Records Act is an act that basically tells public officials what kinds of records are public records and how long they have to keep those public records and when they must dispose of those public records. And it is really to sustain records that have historical, legal, administrative, or fiscal importance to the Commonwealth. The whole program is administered by the Library of Virginia. Sometimes I think of them as the records police. I don't think they like that term, but sometimes I do. And it is their job to develop the criteria for records being kept and sort of the methods and all the process of keeping these records. So all public records are sort of divided into a schedule. You can find all this information on the Library of Virginia's website. We have some information in your notebooks that talk about generally what the schedules are, but I'd like to sort of zero in on the records that you all as supervisors will be dealing with most, and that is supervisors' correspondence and appointment calendars. Now your correspondence needs to be kept 3 years according to the Library of Virginia's record retention schedule. So let's talk a little bit about, you may have correspondence that is not a public record. So I want to read to you the definition of public record under the Public Records Act. A public record means recorded information that documents a transaction or activity by or with any public officer, agency, or employee of an agency, regardless of physical form or characteristic. The recorded information is a public record if it's produced, collected, received, or retained in pursuance of law or in connection with the transaction of public business. Those are the most important words in that. In the transaction of public business. So when you are emailing back and forth with your constituents, or people staff that work for the county, that in all likelihood is a public record. Now, there is some question about, then what isn't? What's a private record? And there's a definition of private record in this act too. It means a record that does not relate to or affect the carrying out of the constitutional, statutory, or other official ceremonial duties of a public official, including correspondence, diaries, journals, or notes that are not prepared for, utilized for, or circulated or communicated in the course of transacting public business. So, you may get a letter from a constituent that's dealing with a matter of public business, and you may send them an email back saying, oh, hi, how are you? Happy New Year. Hope the family's well. And if that's all you've said, that is not a public record. There's nothing in your correspondence that's dealing with the transaction of public business. In all likelihood, the letter you got or the email you got, depending on the substance of that, is a public record. So it's really important to think about that. What's really key about the public records is first you have to identify, then you need to find a way to maintain those records. And if it's correspondence, it's 3 years. So when we're talking about physical pieces of paper, we all know how to do that. We file them, we collect them. If they're a public record and they're correspondence, or if they're a public record and they're your calendar, or anything else that's in the schedule. Where people, I think, get most confused or run into the most trouble is some type of electronic communications. And I'm going to use email as an example because I think that's the way most of us communicate electronically now. Emails are public records if they discuss the transaction of public business. So, as a public official, if you're communicating by email, you have to have a way to preserve those emails. You can't just delete them if they deal with public business. You have to, the two forms that are most suggested by the Library of Virginia are either creating electronic files and then having sort of them dated so that you know where to go to get those records and you know when they're 3 years old, or actually printing them out, filing them, and then you can delete the record. And that's something that I think is not being done uniformly. I'll just be honest with you. People are thinking that emails are just sort of a temporary, informal way of communicating, but they, depending on what's in your public records, under the Public Records Act. So it's really important to set up some kind of system. Another thing people get confused about is, well, if the county doesn't own the computer that I'm communicating on, then it's not a public record. Not so. If the content of that meets the definition of public record, even if it comes from your own equipment or your sons or daughters or whoever's still a public record, and you have to retain it for the requisite period of time. So that's very, very important. I'm going to talk about notice, but if you haven't had it before today, you have it today. There's a provision in this act that says that all public officials within 2 weeks of when they're elected, re-elected, appointed, reappointed, shall be given a copy and shall read, and I think it says understand this act. I think that's a big expectation. No, it says become familiar with the act. That's good. That's so much better. So you probably have all already seen it. You've probably gotten it from someone in your county administration. And I've included a copy of it in your packet and a nice pamphlet that explains it that the Library of Virginia has put together. And I do urge you to read that because you're really going to be thinking you have to be thinking, is this a public record or not? How do I retain it? As I said, the Library of Virginia oversees the act, and Virginia's interesting in that it's one of the few states that requires that you dispose of the record at the end of the period. Now, that has always given me some pause, and that's where I came up with the term, records police, because the question is always, what happens if you don't destroy that record after it's 3 years, 1 year, depending on what it is. And previously there was really nothing in the statute. Now there's an audit provision in the statute that the Library of Virginia can audit any entity subject to the act and report the results to the public body themselves, to the governor. I also believe to the House and Senate General Laws Committees. So, you could get a black mark next to your name. There was talk at one point about some kind of fines, and we were right there in those meetings saying, please don't fine people for this. This is really counterproductive. Audit them and tell them what they need to do if you feel like they're not doing it right. But certainly in this kind of economy, we don't need any fines for not being able to get to everything that we're trying to get to. But just know that audit provision is in there. The circumstances under which you would keep a document longer than the schedule provides for is if you have ongoing litigation, investigation, an audit, or a Freedom of Information Act request dealing with those records. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Maria Everett for the rest of the time to talk about Freedom of Information Act and how it affects all of you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Good morning to everyone. Okay, continuing in the vein of titillating conversation. FOIA, for those of you who don't know, Freedom of Information Act. We've turned it into a verb. Have you been FOIA'd? Is it FOIA-able? Okay. I just want to dovetail a little bit on what Phyllis said. For those of us, the annual retainers in the room, raise your hand. Right? I live there. We tend to be like, no, we got to keep this. Really, there's a life cycle to a record. It's creation or when we receive it, when we're actively using it, and then it goes into a dormant sort of a stage, which is the 3 years, in case we need it. But if that 3 years is over, get rid of it. Get rid of it, okay? Because the state archivist told me that of all the records that government generates, receives, only 4% have any archival quality for posterity. That means 96% of the records that you will see can be thrown away. So I live in the annual retirement world, and it's hard for me to throw things away too, but do it, because otherwise you come down to a box full of stuff and you have no idea what's in it. And if you get a FOIA request and you're under a timeline to go through that box, all of a sudden the incentive to like, well, I wish I had gotten rid of those. And I get the question all the time, well, I could have destroyed it, but I didn't, and now I have a FOIA request, do I have to respond to it? What do you think the answer is? Yeah. Okay. Is that incentive to throw it away? Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's talk FOIA. There's two sides of the Freedom of Information Act, the open record side and the open meeting side. The record side we'll touch briefly in terms of email, which is the policy of this law is ready access to the records in possession of government. Okay? The meeting side is to afford every citizen every opportunity to witness the operation of government on the theory that the deliberative process, how you arrive at a decision, is just as important as the decision you reach. And people get to watch you do it. And they get to complain about how you do it, but they're all sitting behind you or in front of you going, thank God it's them and not me. And if you're doing this for glory, forget it, all right? Because the only more thankless job than being a public official is serving on the board of your homeowner association. Okay? This is not a glory job. When you got elected, you just stepped onto the most public stage of your life. Everything you're gonna do is in the public domain. It is you're sort of on this public stage with a 360 mirror. And the women in here know exactly what I'm talking about, a 360 mirror, okay? So not a glory position, and scrutinized, yes. And so this is operations. So we come into our Board of Supervisor positions thinking, well, everything the way it operates is in accordance with law. So, and you may find, actually based on what I say or Phil says, that, well, that's not exactly how it's going. So don't make a presumption of regularity. Not to say everybody's doing everything wrong, but FOIA has the same requirement to read the law and become familiar. So when you can't sleep at night, you know what books to pull out. Public Records Act, Freedom of Information Act. So we need to know really when it is that we're having a meeting under FOIA. And it may surprise most of you. Well, the first time is, when the whole board is sitting out there at an announced meeting, the whole sitting up at the dais, doing formal whatever it is. So we recognize that. But then FOIA drops down to this rule of 3. Anytime 3 members of the same body gather and merely discuss the public business, it is called a meeting under FOIA. All right, now let me just go forward. If it's a meeting, it requires 3 things. Notice to the public, open to the public, and minutes. And of those 3 requirements, your staff is doing 2 of them. The minutes, be careful what finger goes down. The minutes and the notice. All you have to be is open to the public. But that's a challenge to you. So let's investigate what a meeting can be with 3. You'll see 3 things in FOIA all the time. 3 or more of the same body. To me, this is anywhere you gather informally to discuss public business. This is not so much for the public as it is for you. Because you're going to find, or maybe you've already found, that in 3, 5, 7, 9 member boards, are they political creatures? Yeah. Do you have a pesky minority? No, that never happens. But the 3 of them can never meet and talk about your public business without you knowing about it. All of a sudden it's like, this FOIA law is pretty good. All of a sudden, I thought it was sort of a pain in my neck. No, that's what it's for, is that 3 or more, and the mere discussion. I don't care whether you call it a work session, you call it a retreat, whatever you call it, it is still 3 or more, and the discussion is a meeting under FOIA, which requires notice, open to the public, and minutes for the most part. So let's look at how this rule of 3 can come into play. Do you ever carpool to meetings? How many are in the car? What are you talking about? It's like when you got elected, you got tattooed across your forehead. It's invisible, except when 3 or more of you gather and discuss your public business. Then it not only becomes visible, it starts beeping, okay? Because your basis of your relationship is your public service. So you're going to tend to talk shop when you're together. That's where this is really the integrity and government component. So when people are carpooling, they're naturally going to talk about the public business. So somebody in the back seat should say, hey, we shouldn't be having this discussion. And most of you are private sector folks that are coming over to the crazy public sector side going, this is crazy. This is like insane. Well, this is democracy. And it's sloppy, and convenience does not belong to us. So, to say it would be all right for you to gather in a car or anywhere else and discuss your public business, then what happens at the meeting? I move we do this, second, vote, it's over. There is no deliberative process. That's what's missing. And if it's okay for you to do that, it's okay for those great people over there in the General Assembly building, it's okay for anybody, the school boards, to do the same. all right? Do you ever come early to a meeting? 3 of you are discussing the agenda with staff. Beep, beep, beep. 3 of you are walking out after a meeting, doing the post-mortem on what you just did. Beep, beep, beep. Now, people say, but Maria, 2 of them were talking and I was just standing there. Yeah, exactly, okay? I'm in the presence of it. You know, that's the rule of 3. It can happen in church. It can happen in the grocery store. It can happen when people invite you to their meetings. It doesn't have to be your called meeting. It says the informal assemblage of 3 or more. It requires the right number and the right discussion. So if you're in the car, talk about the Redskins and the hope for a better season next year. Please. Just change your conversation so you do have a choice. You may think, oh geez, this FOIA thing is like the straitjacket of the universe. You have choice, 3 or more and the right discussion. Now, I work for elected officials. Telling an elected official to keep their mouth shut, what do you think the chances? Not very good. So you have choice. We call it the Noah's Ark rule. 2 by 2, you can discuss the public business without the public being there at any time. Okay? FOIA balances the right of access against the need of government to function. So 2 by 2, you can talk about public business all you want. All right? So keep your numbers down or keep your mouth shut. Those are your choices in this. Okay? And it can happen, like I said, the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce invites you to come to some meeting they're having. Do you think they're inviting you because they like your attire? No, they're inviting you because you're the governing body. So that's why staff will say, how many of you are planning to come? Because they're trying to keep your numbers, but notice cures everything. If 5 of you want to go to the Chamber of Commerce meeting, notice can be made. Because do you think you're going to be talking about the public business at the Chamber of Commerce meeting? Absolutely. So you give notice, but it would have to be open to the public. So if the Chamber's like, well, we don't want really the public here, then your response to them is, you come to us. Or you go 2 at a time. 2 go, all right? Now, the only time the rule of 2 does not apply, the Noah's Ark rule, is when it's a quorum of a subcommittee. So you will find yourself subdivided into the personnel subcommittee, the finance subcommittee, and most governing bodies appoint 3 members. So 2 is a quorum. Those 2, the Noah's Ark rule does not apply now. So appoint 4-member subcommittees so that you can avail yourselves of the Noah's Ark rule. 2 by 2, so there is choice that you have. 2 by 2, no notice, no open to the public. So are we pretty good about, you understand where it can happen? It can happen in church. If you all go to church together, and afterwards you're drinking coffee and you're standing over here, and what does the conversation turn to? The public business. Beep, 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 you're having a meeting. Okay, so it can happen anywhere, and that's the point. So keep your numbers down, keep your mouth shut, all right? Now, FOIA does have an exception that says a gathering of any number of elected officials is not a meeting if it was never prearranged to discuss the public business, and no purpose of the gathering was discussion of the public business. So that's when somebody gets married, somebody has a bar mitzvah, somebody has a retirement party. But it is not the opportunity to say, well, we're all here going, oh, you know, congratulations, whatever. Hey, could you come over here after they cut the cake and we'll talk about this bond issue? Okay? So we're pretty clear on the meeting, 3 or more. And the other way to remember this is, remember in the 70s there was a song, and this was way before we were all born, a song that said, whenever 3 or more are gathered in the name, there is love. In FOIA land where I live, wherever 3 or more are gathered in the name of public business, there is meeting, okay, which requires notice. So keep that in mind. As far as notice is 3 days in advance, but again, your staff takes care of it. Minutes is dictated what has to be in a minute. Now, let's talk a little bit about how we communicate. Email, teleconferencing. And let me just tell you right now that in FOIA land, we call it electronic communication means, which means a teleconference, well, in the old days, a teleconference, an audio-visual kind of thing, but look at what we can do now with the technology we hold in our hand. Local governing bodies, well, nobody at the local level, no public service authorities, no school boards, nobody at the local level can have a teleconference ever, except if the governor declares a state of emergency and the nature of the emergency is such that it physically prevents you from getting together, then you can do it by phone. The idea here is we all live in the same place. I'm from Alexandria. I understand the issue. Getting from Alexandria to somewhere else and in Northern Virginia region may be difficult, but remember, convenience does not belong to us. We bad boys at the state level can have teleconferences because the appointees are statewide, but there's pretty strict rules about how it can be done. But what you need to know is no teleconferencing for you, unless there's a state of emergency and the nature of the emergency, whether it's a contagion or the streets have, we have an earthquake, God forbid, that you can't actually assemble. So no teleconferencing. The next question, email. Phyllis, I think, covered it pretty well. The Public Records Act and FOIA have very similar definitions of what a public record is. Anything, regardless of physical form or characteristic, that's related to the transaction of the public business. So the question is, when you think about where it is you do your public business, and it can be a videotape, it can be an audio tape, it can be something on your BlackBerry, it can be anything. So the question is, oh my word, what isn't a public record under these broad definitions? This is not a public record. Neither is this. But everything else that we touch, except for pictures of our family, the coats hanging behind our door, we deal in public records all the time. So under FOIA, people have a right to ask. There's no requirement under FOIA that we put anything online, that we affirmatively do anything. It comes in response to a request. All right? So I know with a lot of law enforcement officers, especially chiefs of police, well, this little pad is my personal notes about the case. There's no such thing as personal in the public sector. So I know people, like, I send it to my home computer, it's just my little personal cache of what's going on. No, if it relates to the public business, it is a public record by definition, okay? So, as Phyllis said, it's not the equipment you're using, it's the content of that record that dictates what it is. And again, you have choice. Don't make a record. You don't necessarily have to create the record. There's no law that says you must put this down, memorialize it somehow. And think about that when you send an email, because it has made us incredibly lazy that we don't even pick up the phone. And if we're in the same building with somebody, we won't even walk down the hall. And God forbid if they're on another floor. So email all of a sudden is just, it wasn't meant to be substantive public business, but we've turned it into that. So be careful, you have choice again. Some constituent writes you and makes you crazy, and like all of us, you feel like writing some real terse little response. Think about it before you go to that send button and think, how's this gonna read in the newspaper tomorrow, right? So think about that. You have choice here. You don't have to create this email record. You can have conversations, all right? I want to talk a little bit about, can emails be meetings? And the answer is yes. It has already been decided by the Virginia Supreme Court. We already know they're records, but they can be meetings. And they're electronic communication meetings, which is already prohibited for you anyway. So the idea here is the Supreme Court said, anytime you're online at the same time. It's a simultaneous, it's recreating a meeting setting, except electronically. There's real-time communication. So our advice to you is avoid reply to all. Because we want everybody to know exactly what we're thinking at the moment we're thinking it. And we hit everybody that we can think of on the board and staff. Stop it. Because you see what happens. In the case under the Supreme Court, it was an hour, a week later, 4 hours later, and they said those aren't meetings, it has to be simultaneous. But you can see, 10 I'm on, we're all on the same board. I'm on the board too. I send an email and say, I think it's a great idea if we dedicated this land to a public park. And then you respond to me, I don't think that's great, but you respond to all. And then you jump in, no. You see what's happening? We're coalescing into a real-time communication, which is a meeting, and prohibited. So now you're violating a couple provisions of FOIA. All right? It's kind of, the analogy I have is like lightning. Lightning takes a while to develop. You have to have a great static electricity, and then it has to get grounded. And once everything lines up, then same thing with email. Once everything lines up, everybody's talking in real time about public business, you're having a meeting. Don't do it. I'm not the FOIA police. I have no enforcement authority. My goal here is for all of us to do it right. Because the reward in FOIA land for complying with this law, especially in the meeting context, you have a reputation for doing it by the book, which makes you boring. And when you're boring, nobody comes, press-wise, because compliance with the law is never newsworthy. Let me say that again. Compliance with the law is never newsworthy. Okay? So notice your meetings. Be aware when you're having discussions. Now, that's not to say that two of you, and when you go to a subcommittee, somebody has you have a finance subcommittee, and the rest of you, for whatever reason, want to show up. Well, if you start involving yourself in their discussion, now you've elevated it to a full board meeting for which no notice was given. So if you're in a situation where you're just, a couple of you are in a room watching somebody else, then just watch. Keep your mouth shut, okay? Most of your local government attorneys will tell you that whenever you go somewhere and you see two others, one of you leave. Because the temptation to get together and talk to public business is real. And that's what you need to avoid. So email is not a bad idea, but be careful that you have choice. Don't use email to do substantive public business. There are all kinds of methods of communication. Closed meetings. Again, there's a rule of 3. The motion has to contain the purpose of the closed session, a statement of the subject, and the code site. Now here again, the code site is 2.23711. It says purposes for which closed meetings may be held. It gives you 2 out of the 3. All you got to do is figure out the one, which is subject, and everybody misses it. And in your materials, in the open meetings handout at the back, there's a little one-page thing, how to write the perfect meeting exemption, closed meeting exemption that includes the subject. Now your counsel and your staff usually are going to do it. But what the pitfall is, everybody reads that one portion out of FOIA that says, we're doing it because expanding or attracting a business where discussion in open session would have, a detrimental effect to us. And the idea is, you just read a bunch of purpose. There's no subject. Now you have to say recording Motorola, and no, the answer is no. But you have to say about a business, an industrial concern, about a manufacturing company. That's all, but there has to be subject. So be really aware of that, because FOIA says any motion that doesn't have these 3 elements isn't a good motion, and you can be sued for it. And it's going to be recorded in your minutes. So if you're Your motion is not complete, it's recorded, so you just made a nice little, here, we've documented the fact that we're not complying with the law. Please sue us. And let's talk about that. What is the penalty? Some people look at, well, if you don't get thrown off, most people are like, dang, Kathy,